I want to take this slow, because this is the part where my life stopped being just mine and quietly started becoming part of America's machinery. Up until this point, everything I told you was preparation: childhood, education, curiosity, obsession. All of it was me learning how to think. But thinking alone doesn't change a country. At some point, ideas have to collide with institutions. And for me, that collision happened sooner than I expected. When you grow up inside a system long enough, you start believing it's fixed, unmovable, like a wall you can lean against but never push. That's what America felt like to me back then. Big, confident, certain of itself. But what most people didn't see, what I was beginning to notice, was that beneath that confidence, there was uncertainty, fear even. America was powerful, yes, but it was also nervous. You have to remember the time. This wasn't a calm era. This wasn't stability. This was a country watching the world rearrange itself, trying to stay 10 steps ahead, terrified of falling even one step behind. And people like me, whether we liked it or not, were about to become tools in that effort. At first it didn't feel dramatic. No dark rooms, no secret handshakes, no "you've been chosen" moment. It started with conversations, invitations, requests to explain how I thought, not what I believed, but how I arrived there. That distinction matters, because America wasn't looking for opinions, it was looking for methods. I remember sitting across from people who had titles longer than my resume, people who spoke carefully, measured every word, and they would ask questions like, how fast can you model uncertainty? What happens if the system behaves irrationally? How do you predict outcomes when the data lies? They never said why they were asking. They didn't have to. We all knew the stakes. Here's the thing most biographies skip. I didn't walk into those rooms feeling important. I felt exposed. Because when you explain how your mind works, you're not showing knowledge, you're revealing vulnerabilities, your blind spots, your assumptions, your limits. And America was listening very closely. That's when I understood something fundamental. This country doesn't just run on power, it runs on abstraction, on models, on projections, on imagined futures treated as facts. And suddenly, my way of thinking, my habit of compressing chaos into systems, wasn't academic anymore. It was operational. Let me pause here, because this is where people usually say, this is where he became important. That's not how it felt. What it felt like was responsibility creeping in quietly. Because once your ideas enter the system, you don't get to decide how they're used. America doesn't ask permission twice. There were moments I hesitated. Moments where I wondered if simplifying reality wasn't just another way of lying to ourselves. Because models don't feel pain. Equations don't bleed. Predictions don't carry guilt. People do. And yet, the machine keeps asking for answers. Faster, cleaner, more certain. This is the part of my life where I stopped asking, is this interesting? And started asking, what happens if I'm wrong? Because in America, being wrong at scale doesn't just embarrass you, it changes lives, sometimes millions of them. Still, I stayed, not because I was fearless, but because I believed something naive, that if people like me didn't step in, someone less careful would. Someone who wouldn't question the edges, someone who wouldn't hesitate. That belief kept me going longer than I expected. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my name started circulating. Not publicly, not in headlines, but in rooms where decisions were shaped long before the public ever heard about them. That's how influence actually works in America. Quiet first, visible later, sometimes never visible at all. By the end of this period, I wasn't just observing the system anymore. I was inside it, feeding it, helping it anticipate a future it was desperate to control. And I knew, even then, that once you cross that line, there's no clean way back. In the next part of my story, you'll hear about what happens when ideas stop being theoretical and start being tested against reality, when models meet pressure, when optimism meets consequence. That's when the real cost of thinking becomes clear, and that's where things start to get complicated. Very complicated. There's something I need to admit here. At the time, I didn't fully understand what I was stepping into. No one ever does. When a system invites you in quietly, it doesn't feel like power. It feels like curiosity, like someone simply saying, we'd like to hear how you think. And when you're young, or just ambitious enough, that invitation feels flattering, dangerously flattering. The first thing that changed wasn't my work. It was my sense of time. Deadlines stopped being academic. Questions stopped being hypothetical. Suddenly answers were needed before reality caught up. And when you're asked to predict the future faster than it arrives, you start cutting corners. Not intentionally, but inevitably. Because speed always demands sacrifice. I noticed how differently people spoke inside those rooms. Outside, language was emotional, political, careful. Inside, language became mechanical. Words like risk, acceptable loss, probability thresholds floated around like they were neutral, as if they didn't represent human lives. That was my first real discomfort. I remember thinking, if I phrase this one assumption differently, the outcome changes completely. And yet the system wanted clarity, not nuance. Binary answers, yes or no, likely or unlikely. America doesn't like ambiguity. It tolerates it, but it doesn't trust it. That's when I started to understand my role. I wasn't there to be right. I was there to make uncertainty manageable, to compress chaos into something decision makers could digest. And that realization came with weight. Because once uncertainty becomes manageable, it also becomes usable. There were nights I went home unable to sleep, not because of stress, but because my mind wouldn't shut off. I'd replay conversations, recalculate outcomes, wonder if I'd overestimated rational behavior, or underestimated fear. Fear distorts systems more than ignorance ever could. America was afraid of losing control, not publicly, but internally. And fear creates urgency. Urgency creates shortcuts. Shortcuts create consequences, most of which show up years later, long after the original decisions are forgotten. I started seeing patterns, how certain ideas spread faster than others, how some models were favored not because they were more accurate, but because they were easier to explain. That's another truth people don't like hearing. The best idea doesn't always win. The clearest one does. And clarity can be deceptive, especially when the future refuses to behave. I tried, genuinely, to warn about edge cases, about rare events, about what happens when the improbable finally arrives. But systems don't like preparing for things they can't justify on paper. Still, I stayed, because part of me believed that being inside the room, even compromised, was better than shouting from the outside. At least inside I could slow things down, ask harder questions, force a pause, sometimes. Over time, my presence stopped being optional. I wasn't just consulted anymore, I was expected. That's when influence quietly transforms into obligation, when absence becomes noticeable, and silence becomes suspicious. This is where biographies usually celebrate. They say, he rose quickly, he gained trust, he became indispensable. But that language hides something important, because the higher you rise inside a system, the narrower your exit becomes. I began to understand that my work would outlive my intentions, that even if I walked away tomorrow, the frameworks would remain, replicated, extended, used in ways I could no longer oversee. That's a sobering realization, especially when you're still young enough to believe you're in control. By the end of this chapter of my life, I wasn't just solving problems anymore. I was shaping how America thought about problems, how it quantified them, how it justified decisions. And that kind of influence is invisible to most people, but permanent in its effects. Looking back now, I see this moment as the true turning point. Not fame, not recognition, but the quiet moment where my thinking became infrastructure. And once ideas become infrastructure, they stop belonging to the person who created them. In the next part, you'll hear what happens when this influence accelerates, when the questions get sharper, the stakes get higher, and hesitation becomes a liability. That's when I had to decide whether I was shaping the system or whether the system was shaping me.